All right, so we've talked about potential output being this anchor that pulls you back, when we have aggregate supply or aggregate demand shocks pushing us away from this long run equilibrium Y star. We have this natural process that brings us back. Now, what fiscal stabilization policy is, it's kind of government policy that tries to limit the volatility of these aggregate outcomes. So, in terms of, both price as well as, importantly, real GDP or real income. So it's designed to reduce the volatility of aggregate outcomes. So what I mean by that is, let's draw a quick diagram over here, and then we can list possible options over here that would get us back to long run equilibrium. So let's say we start off at Y star, and let's say we start off at Y0, which is at Y star, so we have this AS curve and this AD curve. So we're at, let's say, P0. And so what happens is that we have these aggregate supply or aggregate demand shocks that are kind of pushing us away from Y star, right? Any one of those factors that's going to affect aggregate demand through that AE kind of demand side model that we talked about before, and then any changes in factor prices, kind of exogenous changes in factor prices or technology are going to shift our AS curve around. So let's say that for whatever reason there's a contractionary AD shock, and so this AD curve shifted to the left. So we're at this Y1 and this P1. Well, we have a couple different options at this point. Or there are a couple different things that could happen. This may be a better way of saying that. The first is we could let this natural adjustment take place. So let the natural adjustment process take place. And this is going to be this AS curve. Remember, there's this kind of negative output gap or recessionary output gap. Y is less than Y star. And so there's going to be downward pressure on wages, and this AS curve would slowly kind of shift out. But it's going to be really slow because sticky wages. And we're going to talk about this in a second. So in this case, I'll just put an example here. AS curve shifts to the right slowly. That's just in this example. If we had an inflationary gap, then this AS curve would shift to the left, for instance. The second option is wait for private demand to kind of kick back in. So wait for recovery of private demand. So private sector. So this would just be the AD curve. Maybe I'll say to recover. Maybe a better way of saying that. So in this example, this AD curve would shift back to the right. The third option, which is the topic that we're talking about here, is to use fiscal policy to get us back to long run equilibrium. So use fiscal stabilization policy. So, we're currently at Y1 and P1. Instead of letting this AS curve slowly shift back out or waiting for this private sector to recover, and these might take time, the other option is for the government to see that, we have this recessionary gap and to increase government spending or change the taxes in order to get this aggregate demand to shift back out to get us to, to help us recover and get us back to this long run equilibrium here. So these are the three options, and what we're really talking about here is this third option. So let's kind of go, we've kind of already talked about this recessionary gap, but let's talk about, fiscal policy and this recessionary gap, and we'll talk about it with a inflationary gap. All right, so we've kind of introduced this fiscal policy, and we've actually kind of covered closing this recessionary gap, but let's just go over it again. Closing a recessionary gap, and let's compare two of these three options. Recessionary gap And so let's say we have this recessionary gap. So we're just going to draw two recessionary gaps side by side and talk about the difference between this automatic process we learned about through the adjustment of factor prices versus this fiscal stabilization policy that we've just been discussing or introducing. So here's our AS and AD. AS should be a little bit more like this, I guess, because of that excess capacity in lower levels. Here's our AD curve. Hopefully I can draw this potential output through there, and let's just say we're starting off at P0 and Y0, and again, let's pretend that's a straight line. We're at Y star and P0 over here. And let's say there's some kind of shock that leads us to have a recessionary output gap. So let's say that for whatever reason, the AS curve shifts to the left. Maybe there's an increase in some raw material that's used as inputs in this country. So we're at Y0 originally, and we're pushed to Y1 over here. We have this slightly higher price level. All right, so we have this recessionary gap, this green recessionary gap, this gap right here. So there's kind of two ways for us to get back to this long run equilibrium Y star. So the first way here is this automatic adjustment. Of factor prices. So in this case, what's going to happen is, we have this AS curve shift to the left here, and now what's going to happen is it's going to slowly shift back to the right, right? That we have this recessionary output gap, AS prime prime, and we're slowly going to shift back here. As there's downward pressure in prices, we're going to slowly have this AS curve just, shifted out from this change in, let's say, raw materials, and then it's going to slowly shift back until we're way back at this point. Maybe we'll call that P2 and Y2. But this could be slow, right? Especially when the AS curve is kind of shifting out, I guess, is that, wages are slow to adjust downwards. So the other option here, and I guess I'm going to label option 3 since that's what we put on the listing them before, is to use fiscal policy. And so for instance, they could change the tax rate, and that would, depending on what assumption we're making about the tax rate, it could change the slope of this AD curve and get us back to long run equilibrium. Or for example, they could increase government purchases. That's going to shift that AE curve up, which is going to cause this horizontal shift in the AD curve. Now it's going to be really hard for them to know exactly how much to spend to get us back to this Y star. But that's the idea, is that they want to increase government purchases or change the tax rate, or change taxes in general, in order to shift this AD curve to the right to get us back to this Y star here, which is just going to result in a higher price level. So we saw the prices go up and back down in this natural process, whereas if the government uses their fiscal policy, it's going to cause prices to be higher than they were originally. And so these are the two options for closing this recessionary gap. Though I guess we could wait for the private sector demand to recover as well. So we just saw how to use fiscal policy to close this recessionary gap, and it might be able to happen faster than this automatic process where wages slowly adjust. We could do the same kind of analysis for an inflationary gap. So closing an inflationary gap. So again, we can think about our two diagrams here. We'll show the automatic process versus this government stabilization policy. So we're at Y star equals Y0. We have this aggregate demand curve, just determining the P0. Here's our AS curve. Drawing the same thing over here so we can compare the two. Here's our aggregate demand curve. Here's our AS curve, P0. And so again, now let's make some assumption that there's some initial shock. Maybe there's something that sends this AS curve to the right this time. Maybe the price of raw materials went down. And so we had this rightward shock in the AS curve. So that's going to result in us being in this higher level of real GDP in the short run, and a lower price level. And so now again, there's kind of the automatic adjustment, and there's going to be fiscal policy. So again, sure what I used, maybe purple. One is going to be the automatic process. Well, in this case, we have this inflationary gap. So we have this inflationary gap here. And so there's upward pressure on wages, right? So all of a sudden this AS curve is going to start to shift to the left as wages start to get higher and higher. You have to pay more to retain wages, to retain workers or to hire new workers. So as wages are going to increase. So the AS curve, I'm going to say decrease, but what I mean by that is shift back to the left. And so it's going to shift back to the left, and eventually we're going to get back, because it should be Y2, to this initial point. So notice if we have an initial AS curve shock and we kind of just let the economy adjust back, we're right back where we started. Now the other option, which again, I'm just going to call 3 since that was the number we started with was fiscal stabilization. And so again, this is the government using their taxes or their government spending to try to get us back to this Y star a bit faster. So in this case, they could decrease G0, which would cause the AD curve to shift back or shift to the left. And so if they did that in this case, this AD curve would shift back. You'd be right back at our original equilibrium, our long run equilibrium in terms of real Y, but a lower price level. So again, these are just the natural way the economy is going to adjust back to long run equilibrium versus the government being involved and think maybe the economy is overheating, so we're going to cut down on our spending to try to get back down to this Y star.